Hi, thanks for joining me on this tutorial video on how to perform the conventional takeoff and climb out in the Harrier. So what I'm going to cover in this video is I'm going to cover what the conventional takeoff is and why it's relevant for the Harrier, even though it's a VSTOL aircraft. How to set up the cockpit, the avionics, the sensors to get the most situational awareness out of the aircraft during this procedure. How to set up the aircraft prior to entering the runway, so the one-finger checks and other associated miscellaneous checks that may be performed, for example, in the decaf environment, and how to perform the 2 or the 5-finger checks as appropriate and when's appropriate to perform them. And then finally, we'll go through the takeoff, followed by the post-takeoff checks and the climb out. So setting up the cockpit, there's a couple of things I like to do. But most importantly, it's all about making sure that you've got all the information you need at hand and you don't need to commit any extra brain power to correcting things during the takeoff, because everything happens quite quickly once the aircraft starts going. So coming down and to the left, we can see that currently our anti-collision lights are turned off. These should only ever be turned on when we enter the runway, so they're absolutely fine for now. Coming up, I like to raise my seat a tiny bit, just so I get a better view over the nose. You can lower it back down later, or you can leave it if you prefer. Coming forward, nose wheel steering should be on for taxiing purposes. Flaps should still be in the cruise position. And next we've got the moving map. So because I'm in VR, I like to change the colour to red, makes it a bit more readable, and increase the gain to wash out the background a little bit, and then bring the scale down to about 13. Next, I put in the course line. You can see here we're at Anderson at runway, the holding point for runway 24 right on Kilo. So I know that the magnetic heading of the runway is going to be 245 degrees. So just hold down that button, the course line button, and then type in 245 on the UFC and hit enter. There we go. Now you can see here that waypoint's off to the left as we look at it there. And if I look over the hood, you can see that the waypoint's 1.8 miles away. Now that is a considerable error. This may sometimes happen, say again, if you're in the decaf environment and a controller gives you a different runway to the one you were expecting. We'll go through this in a second and how we can update that point to get an accurate system designation of the designated landing area. Coming over to the right MPCD, I like to make sure that the engine page is present, and I like to come down and just make sure that all of my audible warnings are turned up and my cockpit lights are as I want them. The majority of this should be done before we get to this point. Lastly, one thing to note is we need to set the altimeter to the QFE. We will do that after we enter the runway. Of course, in some circumstances, say you're departing and you know you're not going to be staying in the circuit, you can leave the altimeter set to the QNH. And again, under instrument meteorological conditions, you just leave that set to the QNH. It's absolutely fine. Okay, so next we're going to go through the one-finger checks for the conventional takeoff. So why is the conventional takeoff relevant and important for the Harrier? So the conventional takeoff is what it says. It's a normal takeoff like any other aeroplane. It's important to learn this in the Harrier, is if you transition from another aircraft and you've never flown a helicopter or the Harrier before, it's a good opportunity to get used to the Harrier's unique flying characteristics without adding the additional complication of VSTOL. If you do things one thing at a time, you can properly observe inputs and outputs and see what you need to do differently next time. Another reason, a more practical reason you might use the conventional takeoff is if you've got a strong crosswind, it allows you to take off at a higher speed, and also if you are fairly heavily loaded up or you're flying at a high altitude airport, you can use the conventional takeoff blended with some additional nozzle adjustments to get you off the ground at a higher airspeed so that you can transition and climb a little bit faster. So one finger check, starting down at the left, we're going to make sure our stow stop's clear. We're going to We're going to advance the nozzles to 10. I like to look over the hood for this. Advance the nozzles to 10. Make sure the throttle is closed. We're going to put the flaps into the auto position. We're going to leave the water off in this scenario. Now, by the book, you shouldn't use water below freezing temperature, which typically in DCS is 0 degrees Celsius, but does vary. And you should use it if you're high, heavy, or if it's hot outside. Now, there's no hard and fast rule on this as far as I can find from manuals. My own personal rule is, depending on the height, I start to use water for takeoffs at around 20 degrees Celsius. And finally, we've got the trim, which should be 2 degrees nose down, and you can see here it's already set, and that is most likely because of the weight of my flight controls. Okay, so the next thing we would do is the 2-finger checks. These would either be done in a designated power check areas assigned by the air traffic controller, or they would be done on the runway. Again, if you're doing them on the runway, you need to be fairly quick at doing them. So we're going to go ahead and enter the runway. So I'm going to hold the toe brakes, take the parking brake off, clear the audible warning because my nose wheel steering is still on, but we'll turn that off when we line up. Anti-collisions are going to come on. I'm going to do a good look out into the downwind area of the circuit, all the way along into the final and approach area. Just have a good look. And one last look at the runway, and now we can enter. It's a bit like doing a hill start on your driving test, trying to enter from kilo there. Okay, and I'm just going to line up on the runway center line, and I'm going to stop on the threshold. This is going to be my designated landing area. So I'm just going to put the nose wheel steering back to the anti-skid position, back switch back to the on position. And now to update that system designation, because it's almost 2 miles ahead of me, which is a considerable error, especially if you're trying to do sort of V-stall stuff, or if you're trying to do a high altitude descent from quite some distance. So what I'm going to do to correct that, hit the target of opportunity button, come over to the waypoint option on the ODU, and then I'm going to put in whatever the waypoint is for the home player. In this case it's 1, so I'm just going to hit 1, and I'm going to hit enter, and you can see that that waypoint has been overwritten. Now this would vary depending on what op you're on, or what training sort you're on. So an example flight card here, you can see in this one Anderson is actually waypoint number 2, but in this case it's waypoint number 1. Okay, 2-finger checks. Now truthfully, at this moment in time, I can't remember the 2-finger checks off the top of my head. However, the aim is always to remember these, because the more comfortable you are with them, the faster you will be able to do them, the more efficient you'll be on departures, especially, for example, if you're doing any sort of quick reaction alert ground sortie. Okay, so for the power checks, we're going to make sure throttle's idle, nozzles are forward, and we're going to press the combat water into the on position. Quick note, difference between 2 and 5-finger checks, and I'll show you this now, is simply that 5-finger checks include the use of water, 2-finger checks do not. That's the only difference. Okay, so throttle's closed, nozzles forward, combat water is being pressed. Engine, we're going to perform a check now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to box the Accel button on the engine page. There we go, box Accel, done. Next, we're going to move the throttle forward smoothly but quickly to 60%, and then we're going to bring the throttle, adjust it back or forward as desired to maintain it at 60%. So I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm holding the brakes, I'm looking over the nose because I'm going to be looking at the RPM there in the bottom left. advance the throttle almost to full, quite rapidly. There we go, 60%, and I bring the throttle back to hold it at 60%. The reason this is important is we're going to look at the 35 to 60% acceleration value, which should be between 2.4 and 3.1 seconds, 2.7 seconds there. In order to get an accurate measurement of the engine's performance, it needs to accelerate almost as quickly as it possibly can, up to 60%. That's why I open the throttle almost completely, and then just bring it back to 60%. Next, we're going to check that the inlet guide vanes are between 10 and 21 degrees. There they are near the sort of middle of the page there. They're at 16, that's fine. Nozzles, we're going to move momentarily to the stove stop, or to 50 degrees. In this case, we don't have a stove stop, so we're going to move it to 50 degrees there. Okay, and check the flaps are approximately 62 degrees, which they only will be if we put them in stove volt, that's fine. Duct pressure, check approximately 45 psi. Again, we can check this by looking at the engine panel here. I believe this engine panel is slightly bugged. The duct pressure never seems to match what it should be from the manual. And we're going to reset the nozzles to 10. Okay, and I can get rid of my knee bolts here. So an important thing to know, and we can close the throttle for just a second. An important thing to know is if you were doing the 2-finger checks on the runway and you were going to take off immediately, you'd leave the power as it was, and you then do the rest of the takeoff. If you were doing it from a designated power check area, you would close the throttle, reset the nozzles to the taxi position, reset the flaps to cruise for the taxi, and then you'd continue on with the taxi. Okay, so now we're going to go through the takeoff. And I'm going to walk you through each part of the takeoff. So in a moment, I'm going to hold the toe brakes. I'm going to hold the nose wheel steering button. You can see here that I'll bring the nose wheel steering alive. And then I'll gradually but quickly increase the throttle to maximum, so all the way forward. When I feel the aircraft skid, I'll then release the toe brakes, keeping the nose wheel steering button held. I'll use rudder to maintain runway centerline until I'm at 45 knots or more. That's when aerodynamic authority of the rudder will take over. At that point, I'll continue to use the rudder to maintain centerline, but I will let go of the nose wheel steering button. At 135 knots, nose wheel liftoff speed, I'll apply back pressure on the stick gently to no more than half deflection. This is to allow the aircraft to unstick and come off the ground. I'll guard against over-rotation. Once immediately off the ground, I'll bring the gear up first. I'll then push the nozzles forward to 0. I'll put the flaps into the cruise position. And then I'll put the hood into navigation master mode. I'll then look for 300 knots, and leaving the throttle at full, I'll then pitch for 300 knots. So nose higher, lower airspeed, nose lower, higher airspeed. And I'm looking to level out at 10,000 feet. So I'll demonstrate that now. Holding the nose wheel steering button, adding the power to full, holding the toe brakes. There's the skid, release, track runway centerline, 45 knots, release, approaching 135, gently apply half stick back, guard against over rotation, up to the pitch carrots, and landing gear up, nose on the pitch carrots, landing gears up, nozzles forward, flaps into the cruise position, master mode to nav, 350 knots, let's pitch up for 300. Good look out above and behind as we go, and up we go. And anticipating that the airspeed's going to drop, so I'm going to bring the nose forward now. And trying to level out at 10,000 feet. Overshot it slightly, bringing the power up to 60%. And there you have it. a full walkthrough of the 1-finger check, the 2-finger check, some little tips for setting up for maximum situational awareness, as we can see here, the slalom runway ascent line, which would be really important for departure, and then obviously a tutorial of the takeoff itself and the climb out. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you've got a lot out of this. If you've got any suggestions, please feel free to contact me.